Long ago we told you the story of how Mitch had got trapped back in time when he went back to the 1st century after stealing an experimental time travel beanie. He went back to make fun of the Apostle Paul, but ended up humiliated. Unfortunately, when he tried to use the beanie to get home, it broke, so Mitch was forced to learn how to live in the 1st century. It's been 2 years since that happened. Mitch survived, and he even managed to get a job in the Greek city of Corinth as a street sweeper. His job was to go around sweeping up all the bull spit on the street. Fortunately, there weren't many bulls in Corinth, and they usually used bull spittoons. One day Paul came by to see how Mitch was doing. "You seem to have settled in," Paul observed. "I suppose so," Mitch grunted. "I have this job, but it sure is a big step down from what I used to do. Say, since you're here, I've been thinking of something I want to talk to you about." "I read your letters to the Corinthians," Mitch said, "and there's a part in chapter 7 where it looks to me like there's a problem." "What do you mean, chapter 7? Paul asked. "Oh," Mitch said, "that's right. You don't have those yet. Let me explain. You know the part where you talk to the Corinthians about marriage?" "Yes, I remember," Paul replied. "Well," Mitch said, "a lot of Christians in the future sure don't pay attention to what you said about that. It's pretty clear, for example, that you think celibacy is better than marriage, which contradicts Genesis 2:18. In fact, you agree to marriage as a concession as opposed to an ideal state. You even start out by saying that it's good for a man not to touch a woman. In light of all that," Mitch concluded smugly, "I have to say that Christians of the future don't think much of you. Very few of them maintain that ideal of celibacy, and that's in spite of the fact that this reflected what you taught in all the churches." Paul stared hard at Mitch for a few moments. He wondered if perhaps Mitch had been inhaling too much bullspit dust. "I think I need to educate you again," Paul said. "Let's start with how I introduced the subject. You say that I said it was not good for a man to touch a woman." "That's right," Mitch affirmed. "You sure went in for celibacy, huh?" "Not exactly," Paul replied. "There's something you're missing here. If you will look at what I said, you will find that I used the same word in 2 places, by which you can see I meant not simply woman, but wife. You should also know that when I said it is good for a man not to touch a woman, I was actually quoting back something the Corinthians first said to me." "Say what?" Mitch exclaimed. "I don't get it. Why would they say it was good for a man to not have sex with his wife?" "I can see you're still not used to living here," Paul remarked. "I know you're aware of the current food shortages, yes?" "Well, yes," Mitch grunted. "I think about it each time I sit down to eat and have nothing on my plate but a bunch of crumbs." "Well, under these conditions, you can see why a husband and wife might abstain from sexual intercourse," Paul replied. "It would be a very poor time to have children. The food shortages have caused a great deal of trouble, you know." "Yes, I've seen that," Mitch admitted. "I was nearly caught in a riot the other day, and I noticed the local merchants have complained about an increase in crime. But wait a minute. Are you trying to tell me that your whole teaching there was based on the fact that there are food shortages here in Corinth right now?" "That's what I'm saying," Paul replied. "But wait," Mitch retorted. "You also say this was what you taught in all the churches. Are there food shortages in other areas too?" "There are some," Paul replied, "but you're making a mistake. By the time I get to those words, I've diverted into a teaching on divorce. As you might also expect, our current distress has placed a lot of hardship on people, and some have been tempted to abandon their marriages. But what I was teaching in all the churches had to do with divorce, not celibacy." Mitch was stunned. It had never occurred to him that Paul's teachings were tied to some specific context. He had merely assumed that all he had to do was read the text and he would know all he needed to know. "Well, what about where you say that you advise the Corinthians this way so that they can serve God without distraction? As you might guess, during a food shortage there is great need for people to serve others in need, as Jesus commands us. So of course I would also point out that to get married at such a time would be a great distraction when a concern for service would be needed most. That is why I tell them to marry only if they cannot control their passions. My advice to them is that celibacy is better than marriage for the period of distress we are now in, not for their entire lifetimes." "Well, my face sure is red," Mitch groaned. "I never thought to look into what you said that deeply." "I think you should stick with what you do best," Paul replied dryly. "Meaning what?" Mitch asked. "Shoveling bull spit."